It was a cold winter night in New York City. One of the biggest real estate developers out there was getting ready to close on another multi-million-dollar deal. And in one of the most savage moves in real estate development history, Harry Macklowe hired a mob leader to demolish 4 buildings in Times Square that he was just weeks away from buying. This story is so wild that it's almost unbelievable. It kind of feels like something that you'd only see in a movie. But this is not Hollywood. This is real life. Harry Macklowe's company and his partners ultimately pleaded guilty to the illegal nighttime demolition of 4 buildings in Times Square. A lot of questions come to mind when you see a headline like this, like why did this guy tear these buildings down before he even owned them? Why did he choose to do it secretly in the middle of the night? And exactly how illegal is all of this? Because you'd have to serve some jail time, right? If you tore down a bunch of skyscrapers when you didn't have a permit to do so. Well, this story is almost 40 years old, but people are still talking about it to this day. So today, let's make sure to answer all of these questions about one of the craziest real estate development stories of all time. Okay, so we should start with getting our bearings with the location here. So all 4 of these buildings are located off of 44th Street, just east of Times Square, and their exact location is part of what makes this whole story so crazy. You can see here 145 44th, 147 44th, 149 44th. This is a really tight and congested line of buildings, which is super common all around Manhattan. But not only is this a tight site to be developing, but if we zoom over here just a few steps away, these buildings are basically in the heart of Times Square with all of the lights and tourists and action that this area is so popular for. Tearing down some skyscrapers in Manhattan is kind of an intense and surgical job by itself, but doing it in Times Square at nighttime takes this whole job to another level. Right around November of 1984, Harry Macklowe made an offer to buy these 4 buildings in Times Square off of a company called Margot Properties. Macklowe's plans were to redevelop the properties, meaning he would be buying these buildings with the goal of tearing them down fully or partially, then rebuilding them to be brought up to modern standards. But as Macklowe went through his standard inspection processes while he was under contract to buy these buildings, he learned that there was about to be an 18-month moratorium on tearing down single-room occupancy buildings in the area. Since one of the buildings that he was buying, 149 44th Street, was a 7-story single-room occupancy building called the Lenox Hotel, this moratorium would affect Harry in a big way. If you've never heard of single-room occupancy before, it's also known as SRO for short. These hotels are usually meant for low-income residents, and it allows them to rent small furnished rooms. So they're kind of like regular hotels, but they're meant more to be used as permanent residences. And if you've never heard the word moratorium before, that just means a temporary prohibition of an activity. So Macklowe was about to buy an SRO hotel, and his goals and intentions with that hotel was to tear it down and build something new. But that's when he figured out this bad news that the city was about to put this moratorium on tearing down SROs for 18 months. This meant that if he did not find a way to demolish at least that building before the moratorium, he would be stuck for 18 months while he waited for the moratorium to be lifted. It was about November of 1984 when Macklowe went into contract to buy these buildings. He was scheduled to close on the buildings by January 14th, 1985, but the issue was that SRO moratorium went into effect on January 9th. This meant that Macklowe was on track to take possession of these buildings after the moratorium already went into effect, which was a huge problem. The owner of the 4 buildings, Mr. Goldman, testified that he had a conversation with Macklowe, who was going to be taking title to the buildings in a week or so, and Macklowe asked him, "Would you mind if I throw the building down?" To this, Goldman supposedly responded with, "No, you can't throw the building down. When you take title in a week, that would be time enough." Macklowe at this point knows that if he does wait a week until he takes title, at that point the moratorium would be in effect, which means he would not be able to move forward with the demolition. So what does he do after this call with the seller? He calls up a mob boss to demolish these buildings in the middle of the night, just 24 hours before the moratorium went into effect. There were 4 key parties to this whole ordeal and who contributed to exactly how this all went down. First, we've got Saul Goldman. He's the seller of the 4 buildings in question. Then we've got Harry Macklowe, who's the buyer of the building, buildings, although he did have some liability protection because he was buying under a company of his called West 45th Street Corporation. John Tassi was involved, who at the time was a vice president for the Macklowe Corporation. And last is the guy who actually did the demolition. His name is Edward Garofalo. I think it's important to point out that even though there were 4 parties involved here, Harry Macklowe has always had a bit of a reputation around New York City as a developer. One of his architects, Raphael Vinoli, once said that there are 3 things to know about Harry Macklowe. He is exceedingly creative, he is a gambler in financial matters, and he has a reputation as a scoundrel, or perhaps more charitably, a lovable rogue. Anyways, here we were just one day from this SRO moratorium going into effect, and about a week away from Harry Macklowe closing on this huge transaction. And this was when Macklowe placed the orders to have these Times Square buildings demolished in the middle of the night with no permits from the city. On top of the fact that these buildings were taken down before Macklowe even owned them, and before a demo permit was issued, the demolition company actually didn't even turn off the gas, water, or electricity. Plus, to make matters worse, they failed to cover the sidewalks to protect pedestrians like you often see when work is being done on buildings around New York City. So this whole scene was not only very illegal, but it was also super dangerous, not only to the demo crew, but also to the people who were just walking around Times Square the night of the demolition. What happened the evening of January 7th, 1985 did not go unnoticed, and this whole case ended up in court with everybody involved facing charges for their actions. John Tassi, the VP of Macklowe's development company, ended up pleading guilty to second-degree reckless endangerment, which is a misdemeanor, and he did not serve any time in prison. West 45th Street Macklowe Corp., the official buyer of this property, pled guilty to the same charge, and as a corporation, obviously spent no time in prison. Saul Goldman, the seller of these buildings, was charged with 2 counts of perjury for falsely swearing on 2 occasions that he had not given Macklowe permission to raise these buildings. This could have carried a 7-year prison sentence, but from what I could find, he did not serve any time. Then we've got Edward Garofalo, the mob boss who was hired to do the demo. He was charged with reckless endangerment for recklessly creating a substantial risk of serious physical injury. Garofalo faced up to 1 year in prison, and his company was fined $5,000, but I didn't find any evidence that he served any time in prison for this charge either. Garofalo's legacy will live on forever, though, for a much darker reason. He was later taken out by a bunch of mobsters in what was considered to be the last hit orders carried out by the late mob boss John Gotti. Crazy. Last, we've got Harry Macklowe, the head of this entire operation, and he avoided all charges and was not indicted because the state was unable to establish necessary criminal intent on his part. Prosecutors did end up getting Macklowe to cough up $2 million for the rehab and maintenance of other single-room occupancy housing buildings in the area, though. Plus, the real sting is that he ended up being punished by not being able to develop the site. So at the end of the day, he would have been better off to just leave the building standing and wait out the moratorium. Everybody associated with this demolition nearly got away scot-free because the criminal laws were a little weak at the time in terms of what they were supposed to do with a situation like this. I mean, you would think that it would be a felony to demolish a skyscraper without a permit and put the public in danger like that, but I think that Macklowe understood the law and he used it to his advantage. What's crazy is that if they had just turned off the gas, electric, and water and put scaffolding up to protect the pedestrians, they would have only been subject to a violation of the administrative code for failing to obtain a demo permit. Instead, though, Macklowe opted to go rogue and ultimately went on to build the Millennium Hotel, which opened up in 1990 and still stands on the site to this day. Even though Macklowe finally got his way and he was able to build this massive 750-room hotel, the story doesn't come with a happy ending for him. By 1994, just 4 years after construction of the Millennium Hotel was completed, Harry Macklowe had defaulted on his mortgage and the hotel was taken over by Chemical Bank through a foreclosure. Maybe this was karma coming after Macklowe for not doing the right thing with these buildings back in 1985. Who knows, but what a story. I'll see you guys next time.